Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 26, which is about King Henry V. As always, to give people time to join the stream and what have you, I'm going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wild. Your new gods sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly? Bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. Do go and check out his YouTube channel if you like good music. Okay, before we start this evening, let me just say, first of all, this stream is mostly Mitch's idea, and it's going to be mostly Mitch's stream. But we're going to be talking about one of England's great heroes, King Henry V. And I would just like to say to people, before we start, please hit that thumbs up button. It really does help the channel. If you hit the like button on the YouTube stream, and if you want to support the channel, or you want to ask a super chat question that we will address towards the end of the stream, you can do so via Entropy, and that is pinned at the top of the chat. With that, I'm going to say, take it away, Mitch.
Where to begin with Henry V? So everyone knows Henry V as sort of like an English version of Alexander the Great in terms of great conqueror, benevolent king. Controversial in some ways. I mean, I would say a lot of the controversy is a very modern concept, though. At the time, people didn't really see him as controversial because many of the actions, which you can regard as brutal, were just facts of the day. And in fact, stuff like the famous, for example, some events at Agincourt, which everyone, a lot of modern French historians take umbrage with. Even the French of the time didn't have a problem with Henry doing it because that was just a fact of the time. And certainly, whereas for us English, it's a matter of he's just undisputedly a hero. Very much Alexander the Great, who you just also see as a tragic hero in the sense of he dies at his moment of greatest triumph. But it's also a matter of he's got a very interesting life.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out that if you watch people like Kenneth Branagh and Sir Laurence Olivier playing Henry V in William Shakespeare's Henry V, they're too old. He was only 29 at the time of the Battle of Agincourt, and he had been commanding troops since he was 14 years old. Really extraordinary. He had active military commands from the age of 14 and important military commands in battle from the age of 16. So he was very much a young prodigy.
Yeah, and that's one thing. So, I can imagine I'd do a stream about but it'd be ages away before doing it about Edward I, because Edward I and Henry V both share having I suppose you could say apprenticeship in terms of administering a province, understanding logistics, as well as knowing how to win battles from a young age. Edward Longshanks, he governed Gascony when he was like 12. Likewise, Henry V started out really as under his father's reign as Prince of Wales, and directly having a control of subordinates and authorities and military forces in Wales to deal, especially with rebellion under Owain ap Glyndwr. I would start with a brief overview of Henry V in terms of his family. So I'll start with share screen. Duke, you see that screen share? So first up, Henry V is born into the Lancastrian branch of the royal family. The first Lancastrian, of course, being John of Gaunt, the most powerful noble of his time, and in many ways we can thank him for that. On one hand, he did the poll tax that started with a peasants' rebellion in 1381. However, we can also thank him for the Anglo-Portuguese alliance of 1370, when he marries his daughter to the Portuguese king, João de Viz. And it's really the Lancastrians are very much the most powerful branch, aside from, of course, the reigning king of the time, Richard II. Now, the thing about Richard II is he was not particularly a competent king. Like, he was very much a guy who had favourites. He was very vengeful. He was quite arbitrary. He had no problem whatsoever in terms of using the law to screw over political opponents at his own will. He really did not embody the spirit of kingship at the time. And, for example, you have in 1380, what is it? I believe that around the time that Henry V was a small infant, in the mid to late 1380s, you had what was called the Appellants, of which Henry's father, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, takes part in literally forcing Richard II to have to give up some of his favourites. The names escape me, but they are some of the most intimate favourites of Richard II, and Richard II is forced to sign their death warrants. Now, Richard II later comes back with a vengeance, I believe in around 1390 or 1391, where the senior appellants, again, one of them being the Earl of Arundel, who is very much of a Lancastrian supporter, is put to death. And Henry Bolingbroke, he has to accede to it. Now, Henry Bolingbroke, despite being part of the appellants, he escapes the death warrants because he is not senior. The only ones who die from this revenge parliament, as it's called historically with Richard II, are the 5 senior guys. Henry Bolingbroke, not being senior, doesn't suffer immediately. However, around 1396, 1397, Henry Bolingbroke and this other guy, Thomas Mowbray, they are forced into a duel. Now, trial by combat isn't a common thing in Europe as much as certain people who've watched, for example, Game of Thrones might think. However, Richard, as I said, that he's quite vengeful and he's quite arbitrary with how he applies the law. He very much wants Henry Bolingbroke to be forced to duel with this guy. However, for reasons I don't fully understand, Richard II stops the duel halfway through, and what he does is, I forget what he does to Thomas Mowbray, but certainly for Henry Bolingbroke, he forces the guy into exile. So Bolingbroke is forced into exile, and it's only for a certain amount of time. Originally, it was only meant to be a couple of years. However, later on, when John of Gaunt dies a year into Bolingbroke's exile, Bolingbroke is forbidden from returning. So you'll just have Henry, later Henry V. He's just at the mercy of his cousin Richard, second cousin, while Bolingbroke is folding out of his own father's succession. Now, later on in the same year, 1399, Bolingbroke returns to England. I believe he lands in Yorkshire or Northumberland. He enters Lancastrian lands. Now, the thing about Richard II was he was chasing after this Irish chieftain by the name of Art McMurrough, if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't fully understand why he does this, because visiting Ireland is not really a common thing among English kings, especially at that time. And it really screws over Richard, because now he's got to worry about Bolingbroke coming in, and he has to sail straight away to England. But by the time he lands in England, the die is cast. Bolingbroke, originally, when he lands, he said he only wants his father's lands awarded to him. However, it escalates from there because, as he's detailed, Bolingbroke, he knows full well that Richard II, he comes back with vengeance. He has to go full hard. He has to just topple the guy and usurp him. So, even just by landing in England, despite his exile, he's already crossing the Rubicon. At that point, he has to he has to be either everything or nothing. So that's how. In the midst of all this,
he was going to die himself if he didn't succeed, pretty much.
Yeah. So, and the thing was, Henry. I'm just going to have to call him Henry V so Henry V at that time, as a young 12-year-old, it would be 12 or 13 at the time.
So
he was detained.
This is 1399 we're talking about at the moment, yeah?
Yeah.
Roughly?
Midway through 1399. Now,
because this is, I think it's worth mentioning, Mitch, that this is when Henry, for a while, was under the care of Henry Beaufort, who was the Chancellor of Oxford University. And it was during this period that, because Henry, the young Henry, liked English literature and English music, this is when he learns to fluently read and write English as opposed to Latin and French and what have you. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I forgot to mention that. Yeah. One thing about John of Gaunt as well is he sponsors Geoffrey Chaucer. So Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are sponsored by
Hmm.
the Lancastrians. Uh, Later on, then there's Henry V's mother, Mary de Bohun. Sadly, she dies in childbirth at the age of 25. Not giving birth to Henry, but I forget which child it was, but she dies pretty young. Henry is, of course, the eldest, and Mary de Bohun was like 12 or 13 when she gave birth to him. Uh,
Hmm.
so, uh, so he loses his mother quite young. As
People
for
got married much. Women got married much earlier in those days. It is worth pointing out to people in the chat.
yeah, so Mary de Bohun, she sadly dies at a young age. But Henry inherits a lot from her in terms of his love of music, literature, and what would be the word? I suppose, like some people would portray because Henry was known as a stern disciplinarian later on in life when he commands
Mm.
troops, but he was not by any means callous or not by any means a hard guy to get on with because he loved culture as inherited from his mother and other people he grew up with. Uh, so that's one thing to factor about Henry. Yeah, so in the summer of 1399, at a time when Henry he's been held pretty much as a hostage, because if his father could end up getting killed, or Richard could get killed, and he's detained in Trim Castle, which is like west of Dublin, I believe.
And
Uh,
Henry's 13 or 14 at this stage. Yeah.
yeah, the main condition of his detention in Trim Castle is he is not to be told anything of any news. So he's completely in the dark about what's happening between his father and King Richard. It was on, however, there's this English captain of a ship. I forget the name of the ship, but the guy's name is Dryhurst. He arrives into Dublin port, uh, a bit, and this is the end of Henry's detention, where he's now permitted to go aboard the ship. It's Dryhurst who gives him the news himself. Oh yeah, your father's just taken over. Richard has been detained in the Tower of London, and Henry Bolingbroke, your father, is now in charge. So he returns to England by ship into I'm trying to think of a port now on the northwest, but Chester, I think it was. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, so he returns, and yeah, he's not long after that in 1400. Henry becomes Prince of Wales, and Henry IV puts him in charge of Wales in de facto terms as well, because around this time you have the famous rebellion by Owain ap Glyndŵr. Now, Owain ap Glyndŵr, uh, his story is a bit weird because originally he was quite a loyal Welshman, like he was quite loyal to the crown. But for reasons I don't fully understand, he ends up rebelling, and he especially rebels in such a circumstance that not only does he want to be in charge of Wales, but he also wants to put Edmund and Roger Mortimer on the throne, because the Mortimers, they had a sketchy claim to the throne because of what's his name, Mortimer, who was Queen Edward II's wife, Isabel, the she-wolf of France. She, of course, was I don't know if she was married to the guy, she was sleeping with this guy called Mortimer, and the Mortimers get their claim to the throne off that. Very sketchy, but the Lancastrians, they use it up the throne. So Henry IV can't take any chances with the Mortimers.
The young Henry, when he's Prince of Wales, he's also the High Sheriff of Cornwall. And as you say, Mitch, he's taking part. He's taking a leading role in operations against this Owen Glendower chap, and he's still like 14 years old.
Yeah, this is the thing. Henry IV, he says to his son, "Look, I'm not going to give you any money from the royal coffers. Any money and resources you have to get them yourself from your own land or from your subordinates." So from an early age as well, he's always strapped for cash. Now, this in a way helps Henry massively because he understands the importance of logistics, and he really cuts his teeth in Wales, where he learns everything to know about military strategy, logistics, organisation. One common trait that Henry always does is, let's say his troop composition is always 3 archers and 1 man-at-arms, always. This is a trademark of Henry on Henry's part because, after all, the archers, their very own training means that they're very robust. In terms of, so they can also, with their daggers, they can also be quite adept at hand-to-hand combat. So,
well, a lot of archers, certainly by the time of Agincourt, lots of archers were actually carrying swords, and you had to have a buckler, which is a small shield, and a helmet, as well as your longbow, and that was sort of the minimum of equipment for archer. And quite a lot of them had more than that. As like, we're not going to talk too much on this stream about the Battle of Agincourt. If people want to learn more about the Battle of Agincourt, there's at least 2 streams on my channel that are just about Agincourt. So we're not going to go into great detail about that in this stream. But maybe one of the next things that's pretty important is Henry, even though he's only 16 years old at this point, he takes a leading part in the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, when his father is fighting against Henry Hotspur Percy, who was a very powerful northern baron. And of course, he actually gets quite badly wounded, but we'll come on to that in a minute, and I'll pass it back to Mitch.
Yeah, so in his time in Wales, Henry, this is really where you get Henry starting in his prime. For example, he has a lot of capable subordinates, such as Henry or Harry Hotspur Percy, among others. One thing Henry does a lot in this time is he sends a lot of letters in French, because at this time, while English is starting to be accepted among the nobility, including Henry IV, who was the first English king to have English as a native language. But as I said back on Saturday, Edward Longshanks was the first one to habitually use it. This is where Henry, he's still communicating in French to his father, and these letters will just be him saying, "Oh, well, I couldn't find Owen ab Glendower. I can't pronounce Welsh for the life of me. I've already pronounced Glyndor or Glendower.
Glendower is the way I say it, but I don't pretend to speak native Welsh, so
neither do I. So Glendower. What happens is the guy is a good. Because it's a guerrilla warfare campaign. He often doesn't fight conventional warfare. So what happens is Henry just says to his father, "Okay, I couldn't find Owen at Glendower, so I just went to his house and burnt it down." And that becomes a common occurrence where there's like common just commentary all the time where Henry says to his father, "Oh, I've done X, Y, and Z against the Welsh uprising."
there was a lot of kind of guerrilla warfare, Mitch. It was rather than regular pitched battles. There were lots of ambushes, and also, of course, the Welsh longbowmen played a pretty prominent part, which is partly why England adopted them. It's because they were so effective.
Yeah, that's a legacy of Edward Longshanks, which I'd be interested in doing a stream, but it'd be ages away. But yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. So the thing about the campaign in Wales initially is very much one of ups and downs. You can't quite catch him, but Owain isn't exactly capable of, let's say, taking a castle or whatever. So it's kind of like you have some scenarios where, perhaps a few hundred Welsh get killed off because an ambush went wrong. But it's just very much of a matter of will. In 1403, Henry Hotspur Percy, he later goes on to rebel because I forget the precise reasons, but basically the Percys are very much disgruntled with House of Lancaster because they lost some of their land amidst after Richard's side of nobility were purged by Bolingbroke. The Percys lost out on some of their land. And Hotspur Percy, despite his personal friendship with later Henry V, he later goes on to rebel. And at this time, Henry IV, he's not in. He's leading an army himself to Shrewsbury. However, Henry V, because of course Shrewsbury is close to Wales, Henry also has to lead his own army to Shrewsbury. Now, the battle ends successfully for the Royalist forces. Percy is slain. However, Henry is wounded with an arrow to his cheek that was embedded like 6 inches deep.
Yeah, it's one thing. It's worth pointing out. This is how effective warbow archers were. All that Henry did was lifted the visor on his helmet at the wrong time, and as Mitch says, he got a very deep arrow wound to the face. It was a bodkin arrow, and many ordinary. If he'd have been an ordinary man at arms, or even a poorer knight, he might well have died from that wound. It was because he was the son of the king, and he had the best possible medical treatment that he survived. His surgeon had to make a special instrument to withdraw the arrow from his face.
Yeah, I'm meant to think. John Bradmore, who was a surgeon, he was told by the king himself, Henry IV, if you fail to treat my son, you will not get any punishment, because everyone knew if this is a really close fit, it's a really damn close run thing if Henry does survive, because as he said, like, it's 6 inches deep. You know, it's not a wound that's easily survivable, but he survives it. You can find it on YouTube how the wound was treated. It involves like sort of like a little drill to snap the wood. Then he has to put in some wine as disinfectant.
And honey as well, Mitch. They used honey as well, apparently, because that's also quite a good natural disinfectant.
Yeah, and for a long while, Henry has to just lie alone in his bed, which you can imagine as a strapping young lad in his prime. That's just a form of torture, especially. He gets really so that he just contents himself with reading books for the time being from his mother.
Also, if you look at the thumbnail of this stream, you'll see there's the most famous portrait of Henry V, which is a profile side-on portrait. And part of the reason for that is the wound was on the other side. That's why that picture is so famous, and that's why they did that painting. He's got the typical military haircut of the time, which all men at arms and knights used to have, because it helped with the helmet that they used to wear. That's why that's a profile portrait. It's because the wound is on the other side of his face.
Yeah, he recovers. I forget the precise time scale, but it takes a bit of time. He doesn't immediately, when Henry recovers enough that he can travel, he doesn't immediately go back to Wales. Instead, he feels that he goes to Walsingham, which is like a sacred holy spot for English Christianity. I forget the name of the saint, but yeah, Henry. This is the start of Henry becoming a lot more pious in life, because he believes now, okay, I should have died from this wound. I was only 16 at Shrewsbury. I should have died from this wound, but I didn't. So clearly God must have some great plan from it. And this is where he really starts to, because Steve also has been a very pious and sort of benevolent king in terms of how much he patronizes the church and so on. So he journeys to Walsingham and I believe Canterbury as well. And then once he's done with that, as well as the Scottish side has settled in and whatnot, he journeys back into Wales. Now, previously, it was a seesaw between Owen and Henry. Amidst the chaos of Percy's rebellion, Owen of Glyndŵr has taken over 2 castles, Aberystwyth and Harlech. Now, Harlech Castle geographically is one hell of a castle to besiege, but it does inevitably fall. I believe the Men of Harlech's song that's so famous from Zulu was from this time period where Henry V was besieging the castle, or I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think it's from that famous siege of Harlech Castle. The other castle, Aberystwyth, the first siege, it fails because I believe I forget what, there's some mishap happened with the cannons, because this is one thing people are not as knowledgeable of, is Henry V had plenty of cannons. They had used to, and he uses them so adeptly in France because of his experience using them in Wales. Now, the thing about cannons of this time was, first off, they were heavy, really
they
heavy.
weren't very mobile in the way that they were in later years. So they were good for sieges, but not very good for open battles.
Yeah, and what's more, you have a situation where, let's say you overuse them, they just explode. And because it's a massive explosion, the operators of the cannon at the very least are dead, if not other men in the local vicinity. So one cannon explodes in the first siege of Aberystwyth, plus his men keep getting harried off for Welsh, and the first siege failed. He has to return, I can't remember if it was like 6 months after, or certainly a year after, he besieges Aberystwyth for the second time, and the second time is actually successful. He takes over Aberystwyth, then yeah, so this is in 1405, 1406, I believe, if I remember correctly. Certainly by 1408, the rebellion on part of Owain of Glendower is petering out. Owain has largely lost a lot of his gravitas, I suppose you could say, among his own people, the Welsh. When Aberystwyth fell, the two boys, Edmund and Roger Mortimer, those were a high value target. This is why Aberystwyth was so keenly sought after, was because it housed the Mortimers. Once the Mortimers have been taken back into royalist custody, Henry IV keeps a weather eye on them because, of course, they have a sketchy claim to the throne, and they're the main lightning rod by which Owain of Glendower wants to usurp against the Lancastrians. So certainly by the time, by 1410, the rebellion is largely petered out. Owain of Glendower largely disappears off a map. Like we don't know what happened to him to this day. We just assume he just died peacefully in his bed or something. We don't fully know what happened after Henry really from 1408 onward.
Yeah, and by because of his father's ill health, Henry takes more and more part in the government, and by about 1410, he's almost running the government more than his father is. However, at this stage, they fall out a bit, and Henry the future Henry V is chucked out of the government. Basically, he and his father have political rows, both about internal policy in England and also foreign policy with regard to France and what have you. Although they don't personally fall out, it's a political argument, if you see what I mean. They remain on personally reasonable terms. It's just that the future Henry V is chucked out of the King's Council for a while.
Yeah. So in 1410, when Henry is in his he'd be 24. Remember, he starts to, because his father is always in ill health from 1403, not long after Shrewsbury onward, the king really is in ill health, and Henry goes onto the Council of State, and there's not a word of complaint to be had about him. He's quite competent. He is quite austere, because at this time the crown isn't exactly swimming in money. They have to make some cutbacks on their spending. One of those being annuities, which is, of course, annual payments to, let's say, in terms of, let's say, pensions or whatnot, which aggravates a lot of people. But on the other hand, it was seen as necessary at that time. They had to cut some money, and Henry also gains a further reputation as being quite a competent administrator. So, alongside his baptism of fire with battles of Shrewsbury, as well as his sort of apprenticeship as Prince of Wales, and then working in the council under his father, he really does well and really thrives in his element. In 1411, there was an expedition sent to France to help the Burgundians, because at this time the Kingdom of France is in a state of civil war between two factions: the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, and the Armagnacs, led by Charles, not the Mad King, his son, who later becomes Charles the Victorious, later on working with Joan of Arc. But yeah, France is in a state of chaos. The Burgundians are seen as more amenable to us because they control the Flanders, which Flanders, they rely upon trade with us. So when, for example, Henry later goes to war with the French, he's doing so knowing that the Burgundians are not fond of going to war with England, and they're quite. It doesn't matter if they like us personally; it's more a matter of is American interest to have peace with us or be on friendly terms with us. And this is
a lot of I think I'm right in saying, Mitch, that quite a lot of the English wool trade used to go across to that part of the world, and wool was one of the main sources of English wealth in this era, and at the same time, quite a lot of armor, etc., used to come from that part of the world into England.
Yeah, the main vector, you're talking Antwerp, Bruges, and also Calais, because at that time Edward III, he takes over Calais, and that proved to be a massive boon, I suppose you could say, in terms of our wool trade, because he has a direct border with Burgundian lands and in Flanders. So
and of course Calais stayed English up to the 1500s. So
yeah. Around 200 years, it stayed under possession until Bloody Mary lost it. But yeah, so Henry V, he partakes in this expedition to help the Burgundians. However, it's going against his father's orders. His father explicitly ordered no Englishmen to participate in this French Civil War. Originally, he was up for it to renew the 100 Years' War, but the thing was, the Armagnacs, they were fighting for memory of this, because in 1408 there was an assassination by John the Fearless on the French Dauphin. It wasn't a Dauphin, Louis, Duke of Orleans. Now, during Bolingbroke's exile, this Duke of Orleans was very generous in giving Henry refuge during his exile. So Bolingbroke doesn't want any Englishmen killing off Armagnacs when he feels that, well, the Armagnacs were nice to him, therefore he doesn't want Englishmen killing them. However, Henry V, he disobeys this alongside a few other retainers loyal to him and as well as the council. Once Henry returns, he is frozen at the council, and his younger brother Thomas, who later becomes Duke of Clarence, he is now put in charge of all matters of state regarding the army. So for a brief time, Henry's frozen out of pretty much a succession as well. For that matter, it looked like Thomas was going to inherit instead of him. It almost looked like Henry was disinherited because he just got. And this is where Henry learns another lesson: learn to quit while you're ahead. Like, just because you're in your prime doesn't mean you can get away with everything. So, for a brief time, he's not doing too well.
Henry's about 25 at this stage that you're talking about now, Mitch.
Yeah, 25, 26, yeah.
Yes, and this is also where we get Shakespeare comes up with this idea that Henry was out drinking and whoring and all the rest of it. This is this period when he was a bit estranged from his father.
Yeah, and I don't know how true that is fully, because, one thing, so later French embassies visiting in 1414, 1415, they comment that Henry himself was quite chaste towards women. Like, he wasn't a massive womanizer, but certainly he was quite aloof from the court at the time.
Yeah, I think. But I'm not suggesting that he really was out getting drunk and whoring as Shakespeare suggests. But the idea of it is this period when he was a bit estranged from his father, basically.
Yeah. So I forget the precise details, but later on, I believe in the midst of 1413, when Henry Bolingbroke is on his deathbed, the two father and son reconcile, and Henry is now brought back as the fully intentioned son and heir of the king. And not long after that, Bolingbroke passes, and Henry V becomes king. Now, the thing about Henry was, so from the get go, his reign firstly is all about reconciliation. For example, the Mortimer boys, Edmund and Roger, despite having a claim onto the throne and despite having had a history of working with Owen ap Glendower, they are knighted by Henry. And certainly Henry has this sort of Caesarian kind of character about him, where he's proven to be magnanimous. He's saying to his
He wants to reunite the Kingdom of England, and heal some of the old wounds from the usurpation and all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So he knights a whole host of men who are very much sons or whomever, or brothers of men who fought for Richard II against Bolingbroke. However, as you said, Henry wants to reconcile things. The other, however, one issue that crops up as a major issue early on that he never wanted it to was the situation of the Lollards. Now, one of Henry's, the Lollards, I don't know too much about it, but the main thing that the Lollards were demanding, especially Sir John Oldcastle, was that all church property was be seized by the king, akin to what Henry VIII would do later on, like over 100 years later. Now, Henry V, he is not particularly wanting anything as revolutionary as that. Like, he can believe in some church reform, but he's not wanting anything radical like that, even though the crown is strapped for cash. You have Sir John Oldcastle, who was very much a loyal lieutenant of Henry in Wales, very much a good friend of his. But Sir John Oldcastle, he didn't know when to quit with his advocacy of the Lollards, kept pushing and pushing. Henry, despite making his stance very clear that he is not a Lollard and he doesn't want any sort of seizure or any killing of churchmen and the church hierarchy, Sir John Oldcastle just keeps pressing it, and eventually he has to be arrested. Now, one thing about Henry is, and this is a convention of a time, is so if you're arrested for heresy, like the Lollards, you are given a year, a year period to, well, I suppose, confess a sense of guilt, or at least to make amends for your heresy. If that year passes and you've not done anything to make amends, then you can be put to death. Especially for Sir John Oldcastle, who for the first 4 months he's put in the Tower of London as a noble. There was just on the point of the Lollards, Henry. There was a famous case where John Badby, who was a Lollard who was executed by being burnt at the stake. Henry walked up to the guy and said, "Look, I'm gonna give you one more chance to repent." That was the word, repent for your heresies. And the whole story, the whole point of the story is that it portrays Henry as essentially fulfilling both sides. On one of the Lollards, they see him an impartial and just king who is not going to look down, not going to look down upon him, because you got facts of the Lollards. They've got plenty of friends in high places, like in Oxford, among the nobility, even some among the royal court. For example, the guy who serves as the commander of the archers at Agincourt, a guy called Erpingham, he himself is a Lollard. Henry has no problem with him. So Henry never had any problem with the Lollards. It's only, however, with the case of Sir John Oldcastle, this is what happens to him. It doesn't happen straight away. He escapes from prison and he managed to hide away for a few years. However, he is caught by Henry's younger brother, John, Duke of Bedford, at the time when Henry is campaigning in France later on, and Oldcastle is put to death. Now, Henry has no regrets about doing this, and this is one thing about Henry that is certainly sets him up as being a very capable king. Is once he has made up his mind about a given sentence for a crime, he does not waver from it, even though it might be a friend of his. So,
and it's worth saying, Mitch, that Oldcastle, in some ways, is the origin of Shakespeare's Falstaff character.
Yeah, it's reckoned that Falstaff was an amalgamation of like different characters who were all under Henry, his time in Wales and so on, and it was just like a one character fits all kind of scenario.
Yeah, you get it quite often in fictionalized accounts of historical events. You'll get, instead of getting 3 characters, you'll get one that has aspects of all of them, you know.
Yeah, so this is what happens in early reign. In 1414 or 1415, I forget the precise dates again. I'm not very good at remembering precise dates. Henry starts floating up the idea of renegotiating the treaties with France, because at this time the French still hadn't paid up all the money for ransoms of the king and Dauphin from the Battle of Poitiers, which happened like nearly 60 years ago.
Yeah, it was the 1350s, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and there was a Treaty of Bretigny, which gave us pretty much a vast chunk of France. However, a lot of that land was taken over by the French, and Henry saw that, okay, he wants to rewind the clock back to that particular treaty. Now, the French negotiators, they just said, no deal, we can't do this. We're not going to give up this much land that we took off you between 1360 and now. So, war is brewing. There's a famous incident as told in Shakespeare's Henry V with the famous tennis balls. Now, historians aren't 100% sure if it happened that way, but they do know one thing, that the French Dauphin especially, as well as other diplomats, were regularly insulting Henry V, regularly insulting him, not just among themselves, but also in their correspondence with him. So he's starting to get a casus belli scrabbled together, and this is where he really starts making preparations. The French diplomats, who later, the last diplomatic mission, I think it was like second or third, they noticed that Henry is really getting organised. Like, he's organising a lot of logistical commitments for an invasion of France, including like many merchant ships impressed into service, many men-at-arms and longbowmen being put together, food and provisions being secured at Southampton, among other things.
Great stores of arrows that were also made. The royal armories made thousands and thousands of longbow arrows. Lots of preparations, and as you said earlier, Mitch, his time fighting in Wales had taught him quite a lot about logistics, and how logistics is really the real base of a successful campaign, is having good logistics.
Yeah, I mean, for example, a funny one is so to make so many arrows, he instructed his keeper of the swans, I forget his name, to have 6 feathers plucked from every swan owned by the crown to make for the arrowheads for the longbowmen.
Yeah, for the fletching. Yeah, for the fletchings on the arrow. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that was a level of detail that Henry applied to his logistics with the campaign in France. So he's all set to go. He learns of a plot while in Southampton, while at court in London. He learns of a plot against him that involves some of his most trusted guards, some of them who fought for King Richard, but very few of them were also men who were loyal to him for years, including one guard by the name of Scrope. Now, Scrope, he was a son of an archbishop, because there was one time where there was a chance of rebellion under Henry IV, led by an archbishop of Canterbury by the name also of Scrope, and Henry IV had him killed, which you can imagine that's a massive sin of that time.
However, I think, Mitch, it's also true, yeah, that the French had been supporting Owen Glendower as well.
Yeah, I've heard conflicting things about it. So I don't know what to say, but other than to say there was French aid, but it was a matter of I believe that the French found it logistically difficult to try and supply him, so they did support him as best they could. But yeah, for certain, that's nothing. But yeah, that was particularly what sparked off the Lancastrian phase of 100 Years' War, was the famous incident of the French insult as well as French refusal to renegotiate regarding the Treaty of Bretigny and other stuff. So you have that, and then as Henry learns of his plot, he goes over to Southampton and he orders convened a council of his closest advisors and whatnot, and he tells them, "I've learned of the plot." At this point, the plotters, they're all aware of what's happened. Now, Scrope, the thing about Scrope, the younger one, was he personally was very loyal to Henry. He did not seek vengeance against Henry for the death of his father by Henry's father. However, the problem was Scrope joined the plot and didn't tell Henry that he had indeed joined this plot. Because the thing was, Scrope was actually working from inside out to unravel it. But the fact was, from Henry's point of view, he just saw one of his trusted friends, a friend who's been with him since Wales, seen as a potential traitor who's willing to backstab him. And Scrope, among the other plotters, are put to death. So that was a sort of tragic angle to the Southampton plot. But yeah, the others was guilty as sin. And they were taken out of the picture. So, yeah. It's one of the things where I wouldn't say he was stubborn, but certainly he had a very disciplinarian, inflexible approach to the law when it was done against him, where if you plotted against him or if you were part of a plot and you didn't tell him or you didn't explicitly tell him that you were working for his side, then chances are you get put to death, because it can be that quite stern and unbending.
And it's worth pointing out that Henry sails for France on the 12th of August in 1415. So we're kind of on the anniversary almost of when he sailed for France. He sails on the 12th of August, besieges Harfleur, and he eventually captures it on the 22nd of September. So it actually wasn't a very long siege. It was only just over a month. Mitch?
Sorry, I just had to get myself some water. Yeah, so
he sails he sails for France on the 12th of August, and he actually captures Harfleur on the 22nd of September.
Yeah, the siege of Harfleur. Bearing in mind, Harfleur was the first target in the campaign because it was a base of piracy. Plus, the nature of the port was such that it was kind of like Calais, where Henry's plan was, like what Edward III did with Calais, was he would take it over, expel all the residents of French loyalty, and settle it with English people. Certainly, that was Henry's plan. The thing about Harfleur was, geographically, it was one heck of a castle to try and take, because to the south of it you had marshland, which if you tried to camp there as an army, you just get dysentery.
Yeah.
The northward approach, there was a river that branches off into the Seine by the name of Lizard, which is easily flooded into the northern approach. So if you're approaching from the north as a besieging army, your camp easily gets flooded by the defenders. So it was one hell of a castle to take. Plus the defenders, they're led by a French knight, Rail de Gaucourt, who experienced knight. He fought at the Battle of Nicopolis, I believe. So he's got plenty of experience. And by all rights, Henry has a right go up attack. It takes him far longer than he originally planned, and he loses like 2,000 men, mainly to dysentery, among other afflictions.
Yeah, if you're going to have a load of guys encamped, that's always going to be a danger. I mean, particularly when you've got marshes and what have you around you, but also if you've got marshes, that makes it more difficult to dig decent latrines and all this kind of stuff. And if you don't do that, you're going to end up with dysentery and disease, basically.
Yeah, so that's what happens with Harfleur, where you have so Harfleur inevitably falls because the thing was, so there was a chivalric agreement between Henry V and Rail de Gaucourt where it says, okay, if Harfleur is not relieved by this particular date, then they'll surrender. Now, originally, Henry landed by quoting Deuteronomy, saying, because in Deuteronomy it says this is where a lot of kings get their rules for siege warfare, which was, if you surrender to me originally, then I will treat you with mercy. But if you resist me doggedly, then I'll put your entire team to the sword. Now, when
that was actually normal at the time, Mitch. In fact, it was still normal in the Napoleonic era. If you made a practical breach into the town or the fortress, and the commander of that fortress refused to surrender and you had to storm it, then it was traditional that basically the troops were given leave to just sack the place, which would lead to lots of robbery and sexual assaults and you name it, you know?
Yeah, so Hoffler falls because the Dauphin the Dauphin has an army, but he's not willing to use it as of yet because there's still a lot of political tensions. Because one thing about the French army that's summoning up is the Burgundians are forbidden. Like the Burgundians are just not trusted, even though there's a fragile truce between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. So you have this French army that's coming up. They don't bother helping Hoffler, so Hoffler has to surrender. But at this point, Henry chooses to go back to Calais because he's lost so many men. He needs to cut his losses and get back to Calais to resupply, and because he could
have actually sailed back to England from Harfleur, of course, but he decides, and actually his advisors told him not to do this, but he decides he's going to do what they used to call as a chevauchée across France, and basically it's a giant raid, and the idea is he will go with his army from Harfleur, which he's just captured towards the end of September. He's going to take his army and right across French territory to another English place at Calais, because as we said earlier, Calais had been English for a long time at this stage. But his royal advisors don't really want him to do this. They want him to just sail back to England. But Henry says, no, we can't do that. We've got to actually march across France and show that we can march across France, basically. And of course, eventually, on the 25th of October, Henry and his English army are intercepted near the village of Agincourt, right at the end of October. So about a month after they leave Harfleur. And by this stage, the English supplies are running out, and his troops are not all that fresh. As you said earlier, Mitch, he lost quite a lot of guys during the siege of Harfleur, so his army's probably half the size it was when he landed, and he's only got between 5,000 and 6,000 men. That's men at arms and archers as well as knights. The French army is at least 15,000 and possibly as many as 20,000. So he's hugely outnumbered.
Yeah, as detailed by the map there, originally he planned to cross the Somme at Abbeville. However, the French army beat him.
Yeah, they blocked the crossing, didn't they?
Yeah, and the thing was about this French army was because the French were still haunted by the Battle of Poitiers, the king and Dauphin were forbidden from being anywhere near leadership of the army, so they had to stay behind in Paris. And it was led by Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France. Who else? Duke of Alençon and the Duke of Orleans, who are the most senior nobles of the land. And yeah, they're the main ones leading. Because all the leaders are Armagnacs, the battle just does a complete. It's almost like a scythe effect upon the Armagnac side of the French Civil War, because now the Burgundians are not stung at all by the defeat, whereas the Armagnacs have lost some of their best guys. You have like 11 noble families, all loyal to the Armagnac side, for example, just wiped out, among other disastrous effects of the French. In the direct aftermath of Agincourt, Henry later goes on to Calais. He stays in Calais for, I believe, around 2 weeks, and then he sails into London for the Thames, where he's cheered on by his people, because one reason why he did have to do chevauchée was he felt that he had to do something to prove that all the expenses that were put for this war in France had to be justified. If he'd just taken Harfleur, it wouldn't be seen as enough to atone for all the losses and the money spent.
Sure. Yep.
So,
and also, of course, Agincourt was quite important in English history because it's a very early example, or it served as a very early example of something which really promoted English nationalism. The public in England were immensely proud of the achievements of Henry and his army at Agincourt.
Yeah, I would go even further as to say that I know it's kind of like Battle of Thermopylae for the Greeks, in a sense. Like you have a small force able to incur heavy losses upon the enemy, and it becomes like a massive lightning rod. I'd say, yeah, in some ways, Agincourt's kind of like Ab Thermopylae, in a sense. Or
yeah, and there were huge crowds in London, for example, when all the French the noble French prisoners were brought back and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it was really historically it's quite important in the English story. And as you correctly say, Mitch, it's a small force beating a much bigger force and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so once Henry arrives in the later end of 1415, he immediately starts planning for a return to campaign in France. However, he's waylaid by a number of things. For example, King Sigismund of Hungary, who later became, I don't know if he's Holy Roman Emperor as of yet, or if he already is, but
no, he became one. He became one shortly afterwards, I think, Mitch.
Yeah, so he's very much important. He's soliciting Henry's support because there's an upcoming religious council at a place called Constance in southern Germany, nearby Switzerland, where they are to determine the future of the Catholic Church. Because in England, for example, we had John Wycliffe and the Lollards. In the modern-day Czech Republic, or Bohemia, which was known back then, you had what were called the Hussites. Hussites and Lollards are basically the same thing in a way when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
From what I'm not an expert on Christianity, but that's how I've heard it explained to me. And yeah, Henry and Sigismund, they get on so well that they actually sign an alliance, which is very fortuitous because you got to factor, Holy Roman Empire surrounds France's eastern flank. Then you also factor that at this time Henry is also soliciting the Burgundians to his side with seesaw kind of results here and there, because John the Fearless is a schemer, to put it bluntly. He is very much a schemer. You can't fully trust him, the guy. So yeah, things go very well. For example, Sigismund is inducted into the Order of the Garter.
Yes.
And I forget the German version or Hungarian version of it, but
Order of the Dragon. It's the Order of the Dragon, Mitch.
Oh, I thought Order of the Dragon was Romanian, but okay. Yeah.
That was the one that Sigismund inducted Henry into, and it was the one he was going to crusade for after he'd become King of France and England.
Yeah. So that was the main thing that delayed Henry in terms of his second invasion of France, which he does so in the midst of 1417. Now,
Could we just go back briefly to 1416, Mitch? Because in 1416, of course, this is quite important if you're into English and British naval history. In 1416, there was a great battle in the Channel. The French and their Genoese allies from the Mediterranean actually besieged the English-held town of Harfleur that Henry had captured in 1415.
I forgot to mention that. Yeah, thanks
so there was a siege going on, and John, Duke of Bedford, Henry's brother, he raised the fleet and he set sail from Beachy Head in August of 1416. So this is the year after Agincourt, and after a 7-hour battle at the mouth of the Seine River, he managed to defeat the Franco-Genoese fleet, and the Genoese actually fled back into the Mediterranean, and it gave Henry and the English complete control of the English Channel. So that was, if you're into naval history, which as you know I am, that's quite an important event, and that was in 1416, and this is pretty much the same time when Sigismund is in England, and they're having banquets and all the rest of it, and Sigismund's taken into the Order of the Gar, and Henry's taken into the Order of the Dragon, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so yeah, I forgot to mention that because John, Duke of Bedford defeated the French. This is very good because I mean, if Harfleur had fallen, it'd be a massive slap in the face for Henry for obvious reasons, but also it means that Henry isn't rushed in terms of his campaigning, because had Harfleur had fallen, it would have presented fewer tactical options. Because when Henry returns to France, what he does is he conquers. His target is Normandy altogether.
Yeah, he takes. Anyone who knows anything about the Normandy invasion will know that the British army was fighting to take the French town of Caen. And it's Caen that Henry aims for in 1417 when he goes back to France. And his army, Henry's English army in 1417, is actually much bigger than the army he took to Harfleur and Agincourt 2 years earlier. He goes back with a much bigger army this time, and he fairly quickly takes Caen.
Yeah, and Caen. Then he takes over Lisieux and Bayeux, I believe. Of course, a famous cathedral saying where you get the Bayeux tapestry. And then after that, he besieges Rouen.
Yeah.
This is one of the most controversial bits about Henry, where the siege of Rouen was a pretty ugly one because the French garrison were dogged in their resistance, but they didn't have secure provisions all the time. They could have had more food than they actually had, but what then happened was World War Vercingetorix at Alicia, the French chucked out all their civilians from the city, and the Henry V, he chose controversially to not allow the civilian refugees to cross his lines. First of all, for security reasons, because he doesn't know if there's any Frenchmen among them who are trying to kill his men. Secondly, and this is more strategic, Henry's not just there to kill off Frenchmen, he's also there to disillusion the French people against their king. Because at this time, he knows full well that a sense of PR is also very important in prosecuting a war. Now, Rouen is only 80 miles from Paris. So if you summoned an army together in Paris, you could for example, Henry in his march, as detailed in the map, about 20 miles a day. So within a week,
it's a 4-day march basically, Mitch, or 5 days if you take it slow.
Yeah. So the fact that because at this time the Burgundians are now ascendant in the French Civil War and they're the ones in control of Paris. However, John the Fearless, he's also very paranoid because he thinks if he leaves Paris to fight the English outside of the war, it's all the worst of all worlds because he destroys his relationship with the English. Secondly, what happens if the Armagnacs come back to the capital and kill off all of his supporters in the capital city? So even though the French have the resources for an army, still after the devastating losses of Agincourt, they just stay locked up in Paris. And the civilians.
And from a military point of view, Mitch, if you can chuck out all your women and children from your besieged town, you can hold out a lot longer because you're not having to feed them. And that's the reason why Henry V wouldn't agree to it, is because he wanted them to surrender. So you can say, all right, it was heartless of Henry to do this, but it was also heartless of the French garrison to do it. They could have surrendered.
Yeah, and this is the thing, is that the people caught up in me, because they have to sleep in the ditch pretty much, and the English soldiers actually take pity upon these civilians and chuck them loaves of bread. So we're not the ones starving them, it's more the French garrison are doing it. And also, when most civilians later die because of the elements when winter approaches, they're not blaming Henry for it. They're blaming their king, they're blaming the government, especially by John the Fearless. They're blaming their
no relief force turning up, and also they're chucked out by the French. So,
Yeah, so really Henry, there's no problem on Henry's side regarding to doing this, because at the end of the day, the French people are starting to get disillusioned with their system, because Paris, for example, was just a hotbed of intrigue. The Armagnacs and Burgundians are slaughtering each other every day, when they're not, even despite a fragile truce, supposedly. And yeah, you just have this situation where French towns and cities just fall to Henry, especially after Rouen, for example. After Caen and Rouen fall eventually, many French towns just surrender just by Henry just knocking on the door, going, "Oh yeah, give up, or I will burn your town down." That's what happens after Rouen. Like, many towns just open their gates rather than
another reason for a bit of ruthlessness, Mitch, is it makes your later sieges easier.
Yeah, and this is one thing where you have Thomas Duke of Clarence and Humphrey Duke of Gloucester. They branch off from Henry's army to take up the rest of Normandy. Henry, he then, after the fall of Rouen in late 1418 or early 1419, he then goes into a negotiation with John the Fearless, who is now in charge of the French government in Paris. However, the French they have a meeting at a place called Melun or Milan. The spelling is a bit weird between the medieval spelling versus modern spelling. But yeah, they have a meeting there between the French and the English and so on, where nothing is really agreed except that the war is just going to continue, even though Henry, he's got his own issues where he's running out of money and he's running out of his logistical burden is starting to get a bit heftier because his main port is Harfleur, and they're starting to become a massive logistical burden being so far away from the main port. Meanwhile, you have the French. They're also in a tight spot because, well, the government just doesn't command much respect, especially from the peasantry who are expected to fight and supply the forces, especially after the fall of the war.
It's also, before we move away from Rouen, it's worth pointing out that one of the main guys at Rouen was a chap called, oh God, what was this guy's name? Alain Blanchard was one of the main chaps there. And he had hanged quite a lot of English prisoners from the walls of Rouen. And when Henry took it, he just executed him straight away.
Yeah,
but he'd been hanging English prisoners from the wall as an example, so you can't really blame Henry for that one.
Yeah.
Also, the main churchman in Rouen was a guy who was called the Canon of Rouen, and he had excommunicated the English king. But Henry didn't execute him. He just sent him to England for a few years as a prisoner.
Yeah. And this is one thing that so a lot of modern historians, they harangue Henry over his supposed brutality and all this. Well, I would say that around this time, the French peasantry were more, like, especially in Paris and northern France, they were just more on the side of Henry at this point rather than their own government. Because, say what you love about Henry, it's pretty obvious what he wants. He's not under any duty to be generous to the French peasantry or anything. Whereas the French government, they're just not doing anything. They're just dithering. They're busy slaughtering each other while they're on castles.
So I'll just remind people before we go any further, guys, if you want to support the channel, you can do so via Entropy. The link is pinned at the top of the chat, and if you've got a super chat question, you can ask it there, and we'll address it towards the end of the stream. So by August of 1419, the English army is basically just outside the walls of Paris.
Yeah, and the thing was, they attacked Pontoise, I think I'm pronouncing it right, which was the headquarters of John the Fearless. Now, the thing about it was taken within like a few days, pretty much, because they largely just surrendered, and this put a lot of pressure upon the French because, of course, John the Fearless being the main power bloke at the time. And then in 1420. He lays siege to Paris. But the thing is, Paris.
Hang on, Mitch. But don't forget, by before 1420, John the Fearless was actually executed or assassinated, I should say, by.
I forgot to mention that. Yeah.
No,
yeah,
you carry on.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. So in I think it was September or October 1419.
It was September, September.
Yeah, 1419, where John the Fearless, he goes for a meeting with one of the main Armagnac leaders, the Dauphin. I forget what Charles VII, I believe he is. He later becomes. Now, this meeting happens in a place where, because John at this point he's paranoid because he himself has assassinated people, so he's escaping himself. And he says, okay, no one except men at arms, which I'm familiar with, may bear arms. Well, one Armagnac man at arms, a guy called Tanguy de Châtel, if I'm pronouncing that name right, he arrives. He's known by John the Fearless, and he just assassinates the guy by smashing his jaw with an axe at a meeting which the Dauphin previously swore that he would not kill the guy or do anything untoward. So this is a massive taboo for the Armagnac side, and this is a point where the Armagnacs just screw themselves over because now they've destroyed all unity within their camp, which was already fleeting to begin with, but this is a point of no return between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. And this is where Henry, he starts thinking to himself, okay, I can actually take the whole thing. Originally, he just wanted to go back to the treaty from Edward III in terms of just taking back Normandy and Gascony. But now he thinks he can take the entire lot because the French can't get their house in order. And the northern French peasantry are just apathetic at best regarding their own government. So he could actually be taken. And that's what he does later on in 1420 when you have the famous Treaty of Troyes, or Troyes. I can't pronounce French for the life of me.
Join the club, mate. Join the club. I'm exactly the same. My French pronunciations are terrible.
Yeah, Treaty of Troyes, where essentially Henry just gets everything he wants. The only thing he does not get is a dowry, but to be fair, because he's aiming for the French crown, he scraps the need for a dowry because the Kingdom of France would be enough for him. The terms are such that, so Henry, to be fair, even when Henry was, I think something like
At the Treaty of Troyes, Henry is recognised as the heir to the French throne, and he's also made regent of France. And it's at this stage when he marries Catherine, the daughter of Charles.
Yeah, in a way, I think Henry always knew he was going to end up marrying Catherine one way or the other, because his father planned on having Catherine wed Henry back when she was like 12, like 10 years before or so.
Mm-hmm.
But it never happened that way. But then you have Judo Troyer, where Charles and Mad, his wife, and Catherine, his daughter, they grow to accept, okay, we've lost, and we're not in a good position to resist anymore. So they agree to this treaty. The Dauphin, who later becomes Charles VII, he's disinherited. According to this treaty, he is forbidden. At this time, he's over in a place called Bourges, and later he becomes what's called the King of Bourges, because for a long time everyone hated him, north of the Seine and so on, like including the people of Paris, who at this time were more fond of Henry than they were of the Dauphin. And then you've got, as there are other terms such as the ransom that was originally meant to be paid regarding the King and Dauphin of the Battle of Poitiers is to be paid in full. The lands of Normandy and Gascony are to be fully restored to the English crown. The French crown is to pass to Henry once his father-in-law, Charles VI, the Mad, kicks the bucket. So, by all rights, Henry's won. He's done the impossible. He's done what even his great-grandfather couldn't do, which was conquer the French. And he was looking like, and he looked like he was in his moment of greatest triumph. And indeed, after
he returns to England in 1420. Basically, as Mitch says, he basically achieved pretty much all his aims. And in 1420, he returns to England for a while. And unfortunately, his brother fights a battle in 1421 at Bourges. And he's facing a Franco-Scottish army there and loses quite badly.
Yeah,
because Henry's brother was not such a good commander as Henry was.
Yeah, and he's also with Thomas Duke of Clarence. He was ill at the time of Agincourt, so he felt that he had to do this battle rather prematurely to try and get some glory for himself. He's kind of
he
like
was
that.
Killed, he was killed himself, I believe.
Yeah, basically the main problem he did was he charged in against the French army without waiting for his archers to reassemble, because at that time he was staged in a chevauchée, and he just prematurely fought against the French army that was numbered more than his, with Scotsmen who were veterans of like the border region, led by Earl of Buchan, who later gets killed.
And also, it's worth pointing out that the Scottish armies in those days had skiltrons, which were big formations of spearmen, basically. And if you don't wait for your archers to shoot these spearmen down and charge them with your cavalry, which is what Henry's brother did, you are liable to lose, because spears are quite good against cavalry. But you have to use a bit of common sense in warfare. And as Mitch says, this guy was so keen to get some glory because he missed out on Agincourt that he really badly fucked up and lost, basically, and got himself killed as well.
Yeah. Battle of Bourges, I've already pronounced. So Bourges was a massive disaster for, on one, because it's something like a quarter or half of the men at arms were slain, and also Henry's own brother. Previously, Henry lost a lot of good friends, like Sir John Oldcastle. He lost a couple of the guys he knew at Battle of Agincourt. He lost some guys in previous sieges due to dysentery, but he never lost a brother before. So the loss stings him pretty badly. He takes like a day to tell the rest of his family what's happened. And what's more, so this time as well, like when he returns to England with his wife, Catherine, not only is he parading his wife as a means of displaying his triumph, but he's also trying to fundraise for another war, because at this time the realm is really buckling underneath the weight of the expenditure, and it's really come to a point
because France is a bigger and much more populous place than England is. Like, it's got a much bigger population than England, and so the mere fact that the English king and the English army could take over France it's even more extraordinary, because the French had a hell of a lot more manpower available than England did.
Yeah, and the thing was, the Battle of Bourget actually helped Henry in the sense that he had no problem getting funds ready for his third invasion of the French. And what's more, I believe, the Kenilworth Castle, which was very much of a Lancastrian stronghold. That I don't know if Henry V was born there, but he certainly conceived his son Henry VI there with his wife Catherine, and so that he gets together his forces to for his invasion. He commissions a new ship called Jesus, because at this point, I said, he is very devout in his faith. Like, after having survived so many, after his wounds at Shrewsbury and surviving Agincourt and not getting dysentery for about half-fleur, you can imagine he's starting to get very pious regarding his faith.
It's worth pointing out that Henry V was a warrior king, but he wasn't just a general. I mean, like Agincourt, for example, Henry actually fought hand to hand. He didn't stay in the back. I mean, yes, he had royal bodyguards around him. Of course, he did, like any royal guy would. But he did actually fight hand to hand himself. He wasn't just standing at the back giving orders. So you can imagine why he might become a bit pious after all these sieges and battles that he fought in.
Yeah, and also one thing that becomes a lot more apparent is, so, for example, his time, for example, in Wales, he was always quite a cautious planner, but by this time he started to take a lot more risks. I mean, to be fair, the Agincourt campaign, as Giselle as well, was also itself a massive risk on part of Henry. But yeah, you can imagine after a while as well that you start to get a sense of destiny about you, that you feel. Okay,
but when he goes back in 1422, Mitch, again, he's immediately successful. He just captures town and castle after town and castle. Everything he does just goes well, because he does plan things properly, and because he's a very good commander.
Yeah, I forget which castle it was. I think it was Rouen. Because the Dauphin, after winning Bourget, he was besieging one of the English-held castles up in the north. Now, Henry lands with his army, intent on avenging that defeat. The Dauphin, he just runs away. He just runs away because he knows he's not going to win, or rather, even if he has a chance of winning, he's not going to gamble against a guy like Henry. So the Dauphin just has his strategy there onward of just trying to bog down Henry rather than provide any decisive battle. So
and it doesn't really work, because between July and October, Henry captures at least 3 French towns. So, as you rightly say, the Dauphin is trying to avoid a battle because he knows damn well he's going to lose an open battle. But even the French sieges don't go well for the French. They just keep losing.
Yeah, I believe. I'm trying to think of the only town name I know was Meaux or Mo, or how do you pronounce it?
Yeah, Meaux, Chartres was another one. Drouet was another one. But these were all towns that Henry captured in 1422.
Yeah, Chartres and Drouet fell fairly quickly, because by this time Henry's got a massive reputation as just being very capable, almost being like about. I mean, this is where French historians looking at the medieval period, they always refer to Henry V in the same terms as, let's say, Middle Eastern historians talking about Genghis Khan, or who were good, in terms of that conqueror, sort of this conqueror who just can't be stopped, just an unstoppable force with massive momentum behind him.
It's worth saying that even now, like in 1422, Henry was, I think, 36.
Yeah, he was.
He was still a young dude. He was 35 or 36 years old.
Yeah, and he's only got like a newborn son by the name of Henry, and Catherine originally she stayed behind in England, but she later goes to France with her newborn. Well, I can't remember if she took Henry with her, but yeah, anyway, that's slightly detailed for later. So after Chartres and Dreux fall fairly quickly, Henry then moves on to a town called Meaux, where it's held by a guy called the Bastard of Volus, I think his name was.
This is a long siege, isn't it, Mitch?
Yeah, it was the most challenging siege that Henry had ever had. Far more challenging than Harfleur in a lot of ways.
I think it was like 6 months or something it took him to take this place.
Yeah, and it was held by a guy who so, for example, when Henry eventually takes the place, he orders the main commander to be killed off just outright because nearby the elm tree, because this guy, the Bastard of Volus, he was known for, because there was a story, and I don't know if it's true, but this is what it said, was he tied up a pregnant woman to an elm tree and then sent a pack of wolves against this pregnant woman. So she was ripped apart, and then her newborn infant child were eaten by said wolves. So
Lovely.
Henry really wanted this guy dead. That's one thing that made him even more determined. And this is the thing, like, it's just, I don't know how to explain it other than to say it must be that God was almost smiling upon Henry in this because he just had to deal with either some poor opponents or he just had to deal with people who were just widely hated for good reasons. Because, for example, when I said, like, with stuff like Rouen, it's just a position where, for example, when Henry goes into Paris, for example, this year, the French people, like the Parisian public, are more cheering for him rather than booing him, because at this point they prefer him to anyone on their side because the Armagnacs were just that dysfunctional. Plus, they had some right villainous characters, like as this Bastard of Volus on their side. So this is what happens where you just have the siege of Meaux, which takes ages. They reckon that just after the siege, this is where Henry famously contracts his dysentery, and he was originally going back to Paris. However, there was a pox or some disease breaking out in Paris, so he had to go elsewhere, somewhere west of Paris. I can't remember the precise name of the castle, but Chateau something, where he's ill. At first, he believes he's going to survive because he thinks to himself, well, I've survived so much. Surely I'm not going to die at this age. But then, within the last few hours of his death impending, this is where he starts to think, okay, he's probably... This is where he orders his medics, okay, tell me the truth. How much time have I got left? I'm going to say a few hours. And it's at this time he's really getting together his will. He's saying, for example, his book collection are to be distributed to a load of nunneries and monasteries and so on in England. His son is to be tutored by his younger brother, Duke of Bedford, because Duke of Bedford is the most capable subordinate that Henry's got at this time. And he's a very capable admin guy and regent for a while, and up until his death in 1435. And yeah, he was quite adept. But in the end, what happens is you just have Henry dying. Catherine, she heard of his condition and immediately went across the channel and provided solace to him in his final moments. And I believe his last words were something along the lines of, take care of young Henry, or words to that effect, because young boy's not even 1 year old. You imagine being able to court intrigue that later. spoilers, and of course,
Yeah, that
yeah,
will
and Henry,
always happen.
yeah, and later Henry V, his death actually paves the way for eventually the Wars of the Roses, because Henry VI, uh, yeah, because Henry VI later gets mental illness. I reckon it's hereditary of his grandfather, Charles the Mad of France.
And of course it's the Wars of the Roses which lead England to lose its lands in France again, because the English are far too busy fighting each other to be very efficient at fighting the French.
Yeah, and what's more, I mean, you have yeah, this is the thing where this is what's so painstaking about it. It's like Henry V was at his apex, especially among, like, let's say, the northern French, because by this time you've got, if you're a French peasant, for example, in Paris, for argument's sake, you've got two options for your next king. You've got Henry V, which, while he is brutal, he is quite a just king. Like, there's no question, there's no sadism on his part. There's no spiteful nature on his part. You actually gain stability of a god like him.
I wouldn't call him. I wouldn't say he was brutal, Mitch. I'd say he was tough. He was a very tough commander and king, but he wasn't. I don't think he was any more brutal than any other king of his era. You know, you weren't going to survive as a warrior king in the Middle Ages unless you were pretty damn tough. But I don't think he was particularly brutal, to be honest with you. I mean, there's no folk legacy in England that he was an unfair king or anything like that. He's actually got a very good reputation in terms of folklore and what have you.
Yeah, it's like there's been only like a few occasions where he did something that's technically illegal, but the party he did it to, for example, his stepmother, Joan of Navarre, she had a bunch of estates. I forget precisely what her offense was, but basically she was shouting at some archbishop or something, like shouting at a bunch of churchmen, and she was detained for a bit, and Henry pretty much confiscated her land in order to pay for his war in France. I think that's the most arbitrary he can be, but even then, it's understandable. It's one of the things where he needs money to pay for his war in France.
But he's not known for, like, executing political enemies and this kind of stuff. I mean, yes, if people are trying to have him assassinated or having him removed as king, he's going to kill those guys. Of course he is. But he wasn't known for having people executed for trumped up charges or anything of that nature.
No. So that was what the French could expect in someone like Henry V, because he was quite just and fair. I suppose the best word for him is fairness. Like, he treated you insofar as your deeds showing you to be a good person to work with. Like, so long as you weren't someone like John Oldcastle, who would abuse his friendship, or you weren't someone like the Bastard of Vorvis, who would brutally put people to death with an elm tree, then you got on well with him, basically.
That seems fair. Just so people know, he died at the end of August in 1422, and of course he's buried in Westminster Abbey.
Yeah, originally, so some people wanted to bury him in Canterbury with his father, Henry Bolingbroke, because that's what because Bolingbroke. Because Bolingbroke, the thing about him is that he had this contritedness. He felt that he was a sinful wretch, he called himself, and that he did not deserve to be buried in Westminster Abbey. So he said, "Bury me in Canterbury instead." Henry, in spirit with his reconciliation strategy, amidst his early reign, he says he's to be buried alongside Richard II in Westminster Abbey. So that's why he's not buried alongside his father. And to be fair, like, it's kind of like a fitting burial for him when you factor his accomplishments. And plus, also because this is one thing that some people give everyone. People thought that he waged his war in France because he was originally seen as a usurper. No, he wasn't. His father was a usurper, but the sins of a father do not pass on to the son.
Yes,
in England.
Absolutely true. Yeah, well, that's very true. That's very true. And of course, the irony was he died just 2 months before Charles VI. And
Yeah.
had he survived 2 months, he would have been crowned King of France.
Yeah, and this is one bit where I'd get into the alternate history scenario of what if Henry V, let's say, survived for another 20 years. Because, for a start, the Dauphin was screwed in this scenario where Henry V lives a lot longer, because the Dauphin, he's holed up in a place called Bourges, which is not far from Orléans on the map. Like, it's not far from there. He's not in Paris, which is, of course, and you got Reims, which is the main cathedral city, because French tradition is a king must be crowned in Reims. Well, the Armagnac faction are not at all in control of the city, nor are they of Paris. So in the eyes of most French people, especially in Paris and Normandy and Gascony, they're just like, well, they call him the King of Bourges because they just don't see him as a legitimate king, because also in the treaty he's disinherited. And the main saving grace for Dauphin, or later Charles VII, is the fact that Henry V dies. Had it not been for his death, Henry V would have consolidated. Some people say, oh, well, Henry V could not have consolidated his gains in France. No, he could have done, because at this point, a big chunk of the French population were pretty apathetic. The Burgundians, for example, were quite... They had their own pragmatic desires, but they could work better with Henry V than with the Armagnacs. And a big chunk of the peasantry were just apathetic at this point about their own government. So it was actually feasible that Henry V, give him another, let's say, 10 more years at the most, he could have consolidated, wiped out the Armagnac faction, and put together this Anglo-French union into full throttle.
Well, I think it would have been interesting, Mish, if we could have seen him going on crusade. If he'd have fulfilled his vow to Sigismund and he had have gone on crusade, that would have been interesting, because he was basically he was a bit like the Duke of Wellington in military terms, in that he was undefeated. No one beat him.
Yeah, it's a matter of the Dauphin or Charles VII. A big chunk of his own people just don't like him, because, first of all, they don't like him because he killed off John the Fearless through dishonourable means, and also they just think of, well, okay, there have been times where the French army just doesn't bother helping their own people when their castles and towns are besieged by Henry. So at this point, they're just thinking, okay, they're going to hedge their bets with the stronger party. And ultimately, the main saving grace of the French is the fact that Henry V died so young. Had Henry V not died, let's say he'd lived to, let's say, the age of 55 or 60. So he'd be dying, let's say, in the 1440s.
So he would have been around at least another 25 years. Yep, fair enough.
Yeah. So let's say he dies at the age of, let's say, 55 for argument's sake, or 60. First off, France would have been subjugated. It was entirely feasible for Henry V to have solved the French issue. Secondly, he planned on doing a crusade to retake Jerusalem. His father, Bolingbroke, had served with the Teutonic Order for a year back in 1395.
Mm-hmm.
As well as he also planned on doing a crusade into Jerusalem in 1412, 1413, but he was too ill, and his death kind of foresaw that. Henry V said to his father on his deathbed he would plan on eventually trying to take the Holy Land. Indeed, you have and also this is one thing that Sigismund actually discussed this with Henry, where they discussed doing a possible crusade against the Ottomans, because at this time Sigismund, he's still reeling from his defeat at the Battle of Nicopolis, which the French were the main factor as to why he lost. So this is why Sigismund is so fond of Henry in terms of dealing with the French.
Henry never lost a battle or a siege. It's worth pointing that out. He never lost a battle or a siege, so he was a very considerable commander. And can I just say to Duke Valentino in the chat, who I presume is joking, did he have lots of Irish soldiers? No, he didn't. So there you
It
go.
was 1,500, but I think that was like the 14-17 campaign where they had a much bigger army. So it wouldn't have been a big proportion.
No, he had. Did he have some Welsh soldiers and some Irish soldiers? Sure, but they were very much minority. But anyway, yeah. But he was a pretty extraordinary man on the whole. But certainly one of the great English kings.
Yeah, and let's say for argument's sake, because if anyone plays Europa Universalis 4, everyone knows of the Battle of Varna, which was the last real crusade against the Ottomans. If Henry V, for argument's sake, was leading a crusade in, let's say, 1435, alongside Sigismund into the Balkans, history would be very different. Like, the Balkans would not be run by the Ottomans anymore, would they? Like, but just Henry V.
Very likely, yeah. Very, very, very likely. Yeah, absolutely. A combination of Henry V and his English longbowmen could have made a big difference in that sort of stuff. Yes, for sure.
Yeah. I also imagine them because so in an echo to Richard the Lionheart, for example, when at the Battle of Arsuf, he keeps his troops very well disciplined because he knows full well what happened in the Battle of Hastings, where our side, the English, just lost discipline and we got ourselves killed and defeated. Richard then, as leader of both Normans and Anglo-Saxons, he keeps a very disciplinarian hand on his troops. Henry V, let's say, commanding an Anglo-French army, for argument's sake, into the Balkans. You imagine he'd be combining the strengths of the English and French in terms of keeping a stern disciplinarian hand. Because, for example, the French, when they went crusading into the Balkans in 1396, what they made would do was brutalize a lot of Bulgarian peasants because they weren't Catholic. Whereas if Henry V was commanding, let's say, an Anglo-French army, any such French mistreatment of Orthodox Balkans people, it would never have happened, and the crusade would have been a lot more successful under someone like Henry V.
Oh yeah, 100% agree with you. Duke Valentino in the chat. I am not against any Irish influence on English history. In fact, my mother was Irish, but there were only a few Irish soldiers in Henry V's army. Okay, that's really just all it is, mate. There were not that many Irish soldiers in Henry V's army. There were some, sure. There were some Welsh soldiers as well, but there weren't that many. In terms of Shakespeare's Henry V, you're talking about particularly the 1944 film version, and you have to understand that the Laurence Olivier version, where you've got the Irishman, the Scotsman, the Welshman, and the Englishman, etc. That movie a lot of it was made as propaganda for the D-Day landings, my friend. It was also filmed in Ireland, by the way. The Laurence Olivier Henry V movie was filmed in Ireland, and the main reason for that was they couldn't get enough horses in England because all the horses were busy on the farms. So they went to Ireland, which of course was neutral. They weren't press gang, Duke Valentino. No, they were just mercenaries. If that's what you would like to call them. But yeah, Henry V's a very, very interesting character, and certainly one of the great English monarchs. Yeah, Mitch.
On the point of the Irish, 1,500 served in the second invasion of France. To my knowledge, I think they were mercenaries, or because you got to factor that we didn't really control Ireland that much beyond the Pale or Dublin.
Yes.
So if we were to have Irish troops, I don't think Henry was actually swimming in loads of money, but he did get a papal loan in 1417 as a result of his siding with the traditional Catholic Church regards the Kings of Constance. So. But I'm pretty sure those 1,500 Irish troops, there were a lot of volunteers. Because you got the fact that we don't have conscription. Yes. They were volunteers.
Yeah, there wasn't any conscription. Henry had quite a lot of Welsh longbowmen. Again, they were volunteers. They were soldiers, and that's how they earned their living. And also, don't forget, if you went across to France, in the Hundred Years' War as an English soldier or a Welsh soldier or an Irish soldier, you had a chance of making quite a lot of money. You know, you'd get gold from guys who were killed. You might get a ransom if you managed to capture a noble, that sort of stuff. It's one of the ways an ordinary chap could actually make his fortune was as a soldier in France. So they didn't lack for volunteers, you know, and they were paid. But yeah, he's a very interesting character, Mitch, and I probably underrated, if anything, as a general, because everyone knows about Agincourt, of course, partly because of Shakespeare and the films and all the rest of it. But his other career, which is mainly what you've been talking about this evening, is much less well known as far as I can work out.
Yeah, and it's one of the things where stuff like the Siege of Rouen and other sieges where he's seen as brutal, or whatever. That's a very modern thing because at the time, for example, at Battle of Agincourt, the French were flying around this flag called the Oriflamme, which said no quarter to the enemy.
Yes.
So if you're an Englishman serving at Agincourt, you knew for a while that it was either victory or death. There's no other option. You weren't going to get ransom.
Absolutely true. Duke Valentino, look, mate, you're going to annoy me in a minute. I do not hate Irish people. My mother was born in the Republic of Ireland. I don't hate Irish people at all. So, you know, please cut it out, mate. I don't want to ban you. I don't like doing that. But if you keep coming up with bullshit, I won't have any choice. But yeah, it's... I've certainly learned some stuff this evening, Mitch. So thank you for that, mate. It's been good. Did you have any kind of final thoughts on this stuff?
I mean, I would say just as like these are small details, but I find it important. So in 1417, when he returns, before he embarks on France, one thing that Henry does is he has the bureaucracy, like the civil service, basically the medieval version of that, like the institutions now write only in English, because before that it was done either all in French or all in Latin. But we really promoted the Chancery Standard English. Chancery, of course, referring to, Chaucery English, referring to Geoffrey Chaucer's book, because, as I said, the Lancastrians, from John of Gaunt onward, they heavily patronised the English language. So in a way, like so if you're someone like me who's very interested in terms of Middle English / into modern English, you can thank Henry V for being an important influence on that, like making it now a state language.
Absolutely, and also, as I said earlier, he had a big influence on forming English nationalism. He had a big influence on forming English nationalism, and his achievements, I mean, especially Agincourt, but his achievements generally, they had an influence on English and later British military history for a very long time. You know, the old contemptibles in 1914 would often compare themselves to the old English longbowmen and this kind of stuff. You know, so it was really important. And I think you're right, Mitch, that he did have more chance of making some sort of English-French union work than some people would have you believe, because France was a much less unified country than England was. You know, until the French Revolution, even France was very much a country of very, very separate regions. You know.
Yeah, like for example, let's say the Normans. If you like, because this is one thing back in like AI and Bob say a lot, which is so the Normans, while they speak French, they are not French themselves. They're very different. Like,
yeah, I mean, originally it was the Norsemen, of course, which is how they got their name. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's like the University of Paris. You'd have like 4 groups. So you have a Germanic group, so basically we English are grouped in with lots of the Scandinavians and the Germans, basically the whole Roman Empire. Then you go second group, which is the French, but that also includes the Italians and the Spanish because they're not unified realms, so they are under the French label. You then got the Norman branch, because the Normans are deemed a separate nation from the English and the French. And then you got the fourth nation being the Flemish, because again the Flemish are just so distinct from the French. So, I'm the Normans.
I'm not a language expert like you, Mitch, but I do, as far as I understand it, that until the French Revolution, even the French language was really different in different parts of France.
Yeah, it's only like half the French population actually spoke French. Like you had regional language like Breton, you had Flemish. Some areas spoke German in Alsace-Lorraine. Some areas spoke Italian, like in the Alpine Mountains. You also had another language. You also had Basque nearby the Spanish border, and you also had another language called Occitan. Occitan's kind of like a midway between French, Spanish, and Italian. Very interesting language, but sadly it's largely disappeared because of the French Revolution, basically.
Yeah, I know the area. I know the area in France around Perpignan is very different. Even today, it's quite different to a lot of the other parts of France.
Yeah, and it's because you are that's one thing you have because you have the Bretons now. It's like, for example, you have the Duke of Brittany, the Battle of Agincourt, but he's kind of like the Bretons in a way. They're loyal to the French, but also quite aloof. It's never really fully established. You can't. I don't know how you can describe it other than to say the Bretons are kind of like they're small people, pretty much, in the face of like just being bordering with French, but at the same time they're quite aloof. You've got the Gascons. Now, the people of Gascony, they prefer us to the French at this time. The Normans is like half of them support England, half of them support the French. But in Henry V's time, they all support Henry because, well, Henry himself is descended from William the Conqueror, plus he seems just to be a lot more respectful king. He seems a lot more respectable, admirable. And then you've got, let's say, what else? You got. He's only like really in the center of a country like Paris and so on, where French is actually spoken, and even before the French Revolution, there's so many dialects that if you were a guy from Paris and you went over to, let's say, the Vendée, you'd have trouble fully understanding what people were saying back then. But because of the French Revolution, the French Revolution was massively standardized and everything, and it's just showing all those regional differences.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mitch. I totally agree with you. Look, Duke Valentino in the chat, mate. I'm sorry, I don't want to have a go at you, but you turned around and said I hate somebody who I don't hate. I don't hate the Irish people. In fact, I'm less anti-Irish than many Englishmen are. But there we go. Ask some of my mates. Ask Mitch. I'm not especially anti-Irish at all, to be honest. But if you ask me, were the majority of Henry V's troops Irish? They weren't. They just weren't. So there you go. It's like, and like I said, I don't hate the Irish. I never have. My mother was Irish. It's like that would be a bit insane, really, wouldn't it?
Yeah, like the Irish. You got to factor out this time. Like Richard II, for example, he visited Ireland, but that was not a common occurrence for English kings to do. In fact, Ireland was seen as a backwater. Now, that was just the perception of the time among the English nobility. They didn't particularly like the Irish. Because at this time as well, you also got that, for example, you have a Battle of Verneuil in 1424. Now, the Scottish all get killed off.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mitch, but also one thing people you should bear in mind is that this time, in the 1400s, the English were Catholic as well as the Irish. Everyone was, pretty much. So there wasn't even that separation,
Yeah, and it's and the thing it's like it's like, for example, there wasn't really much of British unity because, like, for example, you have a Battle of Verneuil where the Scotsmen all get slain because at that time, you know, there was still like it wasn't like it's not like now where English, Scots, Irish, and Welsh generally get on well enough.
Yeah,
Whereas back then it was a lot more.
this is long before the Union or anything like that. So yeah, long before the Act of Union and this sort of stuff. And you know, many people, apart from soldiers and sailors, of course, but many people like were born, lived, and died like within 10 miles of where they were born. It was quite common back then. The only people who did lots of traveling were people like soldiers and also sailors, of course.
Yeah, and it's for example, you have the Irish. I mean, at this time, yeah, some people did comment about how exotic the Irish seemed because they had like a special way of art, like because you have the gallow glass, I believe they're called. They were like seen as a novelty to the eyes of the French when Henry was campaigning. But other than that, I mean, there's not really much of a historical mention of those specific Irish, other than mentions of their uniforms. Like, so it's a kind of like they were just like I don't know, just a standard same as the rest of like the Welsh and the English who fought alongside Henry V. Like, I won't say if there was anything special about the Irish at this time in terms of how we conducted ourselves in our military. It was only really like 19. I imagine like the 19th century was really when you have loads of Irish joining the British Army.
18th and 19th centuries, yeah, for sure. Yeah, 18th and 19th centuries was when that became.
Yeah. Whereas back in this time of the 1400s, you know, it was a matter of the Irish. They were quite aloof. They might be under nominal authority, but in de facto terms, they just did their own thing. We didn't really have much authority beyond Dublin and the Pale.
So absolutely right, Mitch. That's entirely correct. Anyway, Mitch, I've learned something this evening. There's quite a lot of stuff you told us about today that I certainly didn't know. So, and this stream was Mitch's suggestion, by the way, and a very good one. So, yeah, and we'll certainly do Edward Longshanks at some point. I'm more than happy to do that. As I said to you, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago now, at some stage we should do what happened after the Norman Conquest. Because I don't know much about that, whereas I know you know a lot more about it because you're into your Anglo-Saxon history and the rest of it. So at some stage we should also do that. That would make an interesting stream, I think. And I certainly want to do the Third Crusade at some point as well with Richard the Lionheart. I think that would make an interesting stream as well because it's where St. George first becomes really associated with England. So that I think would be also an interesting stream. We will be back, guys. Mitch, did you have anything you wanted to plug, mate?
Nah, not for me.
All right. Hopefully Mitch will be back on Saturday. We'll be back with our normal Splendid Isolation current affairs stream on Saturday evening UK time. Same time as this, but on Saturday. And hopefully Mitch will be a guest on that. He usually is. And we will be back next week with a subject I don't yet know. I've got to work out what we're going to do next week. The Black Prince Alabaster is suggesting, yes, he would be another good one that I'd be more than happy to do. Another very interesting chap. And of course, the Victor of Patiers, which was the battle Mitch mentioned early in the stream.
Yeah, I would float up doing like Richard the Lionheart, Edward Longshanks, Edward III, and Edward Black Prince, but that'll be ages away because I've got a book about Edward Longshanks I read by Mark Morris, which is a good read, but a lot of it is really confusing because a lot of it's like really legalistic kind of stuff. Like you have to have a lawyer's mind to fully understand it. So, because you got to factor, he was in charge of Gascony, which I mean, because it's like 100 Years' War. was like one reason it started was because you had like this legal quagmire where you have our lands in France, technically under the French crown, but they're ruled over by the English crown, and it just creates this overlapping legal quandary that takes war to fully fix or get a solution towards.
Yeah,
and it gets a bit confusing.
Absolutely, mate. All right, I'm gonna play us out with a tune, as I often do, if I can get it to play, and hopefully this one's appropriate. Where are we? Boom, boom, boom. There we go. Okay, and that was an English dance tune from the 13th and 14th centuries. And the illustration was a game of football as it was originally played, with no rules around the streets and a great deal of violence by all accounts. And that comes from Patriotic Archive, who is a friend of the channel. He's in my Discord. Good bloke, and if you like good traditional and military and naval music, Patriotic Archive is the place to go and look for it on YouTube. Okay, well, thank you very much to my guest Mitch, because this was mainly his stream. I certainly couldn't have done this stream on my own. And we will see you guys on Saturday for Splendid Isolation. And in the meantime, don't let the bastards grind you down. Oh, and please like the stream, guys. It really does help.